They called him the Guardian, but he had failed to protect the one thing that mattered. Now they called him nothing at all. The whispers in the dark corners of the city, the ones that used to speak his name with reverence, now hissed with contempt. He was a ghost in his own life, a specter haunted by the memory of his own weakness. He had stood on the precipice of greatness, a warrior forged in the fires of discipline, his will as unbending as the steel he wielded. But the flames had died, leaving behind only the cold, brittle ash of regret. Every morning the reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a man with hollow eyes and a soul that had been chipped away piece by compromise and complacency. The world saw a man who had fallen from grace, but he knew the truth was far more damning. He hadn't fallen. He had let go. He had surrendered his strength not to a greater force, but to the insidious creep of his own doubt. The discipline that had once been his armor was now a distant echo, a language he no longer understood. The steel, once an extension of his will, felt foreign in his hands, heavy with the weight of his failures. He was a guardian who had abandoned his post, a warrior who had laid down his sword not in defeat, but in apathy. And in the silence of his self-imposed exile, a question began to smolder, a single, terrifying spark in the darkness. What happens when the guardian forgets how to guard himself? The city still needed a protector, the shadows still harbored monsters, but the man who was once its shield was now lost in a labyrinth of his own making. The path back was not one of glory or redemption, not yet. It was a path of pain, of reforging a broken will, of reclaiming a legacy written in sweat and steel. This is the story of that return, not a triumphant charge back into the light, but a slow, arduous crawl out of the abyss, fueled by the embers of a forgotten fire and the cold, hard reality of the iron in his hands. The first step was acknowledging the decay, not just the physical softness that had crept in, the dulling of reflexes that were once lightning fast, but the rot in his spirit. He had become a master of excuses, a craftsman of self-deception. He told himself he was resting, recharging, but he knew it was a lie. He was hiding. The world had tested him, and he had been found wanting. The memory of that failure was a venom that coursed through his veins, paralyzing him. He would see their faces in his dreams, the ones he was supposed to protect, their eyes filled not with accusation, but with a sorrowful understanding that was far worse. They had believed in him, and he had failed them. That was the simple, brutal truth he had been running from. The discipline he once revered, the relentless pursuit of excellence, now seemed like a cruel joke. What was the point of all that sacrifice if, in the moment of truth, it all crumbled to dust? He had built a fortress of discipline, but he had neglected the foundation, the unwavering belief in his own worthiness. And so, the fortress had collapsed from within. He started with the simplest of acts, the ones he had abandoned first. The pre-dawn chill was a shock to his system, a stark reminder of the comfort he had allowed himself to wallow in. His bed, once a place of rest, had become a prison of lethargy. Forcing himself out of it was the first battle of the day, a silent war waged against the seductive pull of oblivion. His body screamed in protest, every muscle ached with the memory of disuse. The calluses on his hands, once a testament to his dedication, had softened just like his resolve. He picked up the steel, the cold, unforgiving weight of a familiar stranger in his grasp. It was not a sword of legend, not a mythical blade, but a simple, unadorned piece of iron. It was honest. It didn't care about his past glories or his present misery. It only responded to the force he applied, the sweat he shed, the focus he brought to each movement. The early days were a symphony of agony. His lungs burned, his limbs trembled, and his mind, so accustomed to the quiet hum of apathy, now roared with a chorus of doubt. You're too old for this. You've lost it. This is pointless. You'll only fail again. The voices were relentless, a cacophony of his deepest fears. But in the midst of that internal storm, a strange thing began to happen. The pain became a focal point, a tangible sensation he could push against. The burn in his muscles was real, a fire that was purifying, not destroying. The sweat that dripped from his brow was a baptism, washing away the layers of self-pity. He learned to listen to the rhythm of his own breathing, to the steady beat of his heart, to the whisper of the steel as it cut through the air. In that symphony of effort, the voices of doubt began to fade, drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming reality of the present moment. He didn't seek to reclaim his former glory overnight. That was the trap he had fallen into before, the obsession with the destination that made him despise the journey. This time, it was different. He focused on the process, on the single, perfect repetition. The precise angle of the blade, the controlled explosion of movement, the unwavering focus of his gaze. Each session was a meditation, a conversation between his body, his mind, and the steel. He was not just training his muscles. He was retraining his will. He was teaching himself to embrace discomfort, to find strength in struggle, to see failure not as a final judgment, but as a necessary step in the process of growth. The city outside his self-imposed exile continued on its chaotic dance of light and shadow. He could hear the sirens in the distant echoes of the battles he had once fought. There was a part of him that yearned to rush back into the fray, to prove that he was still the guardian. But he resisted the urge. He knew that to face the external darkness, he first had to conquer the darkness within. He had to become a fortress again, but this time, one built on a foundation of unshakable self-awareness. He had to understand his weaknesses, not to be defined by them, but to fortify them. He had to accept his past failures, not as a brand of shame, but as a lesson etched into his very being. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic transformation, but a gradual hardening, a quiet reforging. The hollowness in his eyes began to be replaced by a glimmer of the old fire. The stranger in the mirror started to look a little more familiar. He was still scarred, still haunted, but he was no longer broken. The pieces were being put back together, not in the same way as before, but stronger, welded together by the heat of his renewed discipline. He was learning that true strength wasn't about being invincible, about never falling. It was about having the courage to get back up, to face the pain, to pick up the steel, and to start again, one deliberate, focused movement at a time. The fallen guardian was still fallen, but he was no longer content to lie in the dust. He was rising, not with a roar, but with the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who had looked into the abyss and had chosen to climb. He began to venture out, not as a guardian, but as an observer. He walked the streets he had once protected, his face cloaked in the anonymity of the crowd. He saw the cracks in the city's facade, the fear in people's eyes, the predators that thrived in the shadows. He felt the old instincts stir within him, the primal urge to intervene, to protect. But he held back. He was not ready. Not yet. This was a different kind of training, a discipline of the mind. He had to learn to see the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. He had to understand the intricate dance of cause and effect, the subtle currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. He had been a blunt instrument before, a force of nature that crashed against the problems of the city. Now, he needed to become a surgeon, precise, calculated, and with a deep understanding of the anatomy of the darkness he was fighting. He spent his days in the city's libraries, poring over books on history, philosophy, and strategy. He studied the great minds of the past, the warriors and thinkers who had grappled with the same questions that now consumed him. He found solace in the Stoics, in their emphasis on what was within his control and what was not. He had spent so much of his life trying to control the world around him, to impose his will on the chaos. Now he was learning to focus on the one thing he could truly master, himself. His thoughts, his actions, his responses to the world. That was the true battlefield, the one he had neglected for so long. He also sought out the forgotten corners of the city, the places where the disenfranchised and the dispossessed gathered. He listened to their stories, their struggles, their quiet acts of defiance. He saw a different kind of strength, not the explosive power of a warrior, but the resilient, enduring strength of people who refused to be broken by a world that had cast them aside. He learned that true guardianship was not just about fighting monsters in the dark. It was about nurturing the light in the hearts of the people. It was about empowering them to become their own guardians. This period of observation and learning was a crucial part of his return. It tempered his rage, replaced his arrogance with humility, and gave him a purpose that was greater than his own personal redemption. He was no longer fighting for himself, for his own tarnished legacy. He was fighting for them, for the silent majority who just wanted to live their lives in peace, free from the fear that gnawed at the edges of their existence. The steel in his hands felt different now. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of his commitment, a physical manifestation of his renewed purpose. The calluses on his hands returned, thicker and tougher than before. The movements, once hesitant and uncertain, were now fluid and precise, imbued with a newfound sense of clarity. He was not just going through the motions, he was embodying the principles he had learned. Discipline was no longer a chore, it was a form of liberation. It was the scaffolding that allowed him to build a stronger, more resilient version of himself. One evening, as he was walking through a dimly lit alley, a familiar scent filled the air: fear. He saw a group of men cornering a young woman, their laughter a harsh, discordant sound in the quiet night. The old guardian would have charged in without a second thought, a whirlwind of righteous fury. But the new man, the one forged in the crucible of self-reflection and discipline, paused. He observed. He assessed the situation, the number of assailants, their weapons, the layout of the alley. He was not driven by emotion, but by a cold, calculated sense of purpose. When he moved, it was not with the explosive rage of his past, but with a quiet, deadly efficiency. Every movement was precise, every strike deliberate. He was not there to punish, but to protect. He disarmed the men with a series of swift, disabling blows, his movements so fluid they seemed almost effortless. He did not revel in their pain, nor did he linger to savor his victory. He simply created a path for the woman to escape, his presence a silent, unyielding shield. After she was safe, he melted back into the shadows, his heart not pounding with adrenaline but with a calm, steady rhythm. He had faced the darkness again, not as a fallen hero seeking redemption, but as a guardian who had finally understood the true meaning of his calling. It was not about the glory, the recognition, or the validation of others. It was about the quiet, unwavering commitment to be a force for good in a world that so desperately needed it. The incident in the alley was a turning point. It was the first time he had acted not out of a sense of duty or a desire to reclaim his past, but out of a genuine, selfless desire to protect. The whispers in the dark corners of the city began to change. They were no longer hisses of contempt, but murmurs of a new legend, a shadow that moved with purpose, a silent protector who asked for nothing in return. He did not seek out these new whispers, nor did he pay them any mind. He knew that his journey was far from over. The city was still a labyrinth of darkness, and there were still monsters lurking in its depths. But he was no longer lost. He had a compass, a set of principles that guided him through the shadows. The discipline was his true north, the steel a constant reminder of the strength he held within. His training intensified, but it was no longer a solitary pursuit. He sought out other masters, other disciplines, other ways of seeing the world. He learned from martial artists who taught him the art of yielding, of using his opponent's strength against them. He learned from meditation gurus who taught him the power of stillness, of finding clarity in the midst of chaos. He learned from community organizers who taught him the strength of collective action, of building bridges instead of walls. He was no longer a lone wolf, a solitary warrior fighting a one-man war. He was becoming a part of something larger than himself, a network of individuals who were all working in their own way to make the city a better place. He was not their leader, nor did he seek to be. He was a catalyst, a silent partner, a guardian who understood that the most powerful weapon against the darkness was not a sword, but a united front. The fallen guardian was gone. In his place stood a man who had not just returned but had been reborn. He had walked through the fire of his own failure and had emerged stronger, wiser, and with a purpose that was as unshakable as the steel he carried. He was a testament to the power of discipline, not as a means of punishment or self-flagellation, but as a path to self-mastery. He was a living embodiment of the idea that it is never too late to change, to grow, to become the person you were always meant to be. The city still had its heroes, its public figures who basked in the limelight. But in the shadows, in the quiet corners where hope was a flickering flame, there was a new legend being whispered. A legend of a guardian who had fallen but who had learned to fly again, not on wings of glory, but on the silent, steady winds of discipline and steel. And for the first time in a long time, the man who was once a stranger in his own life could look in the mirror and see not a fallen hero, but a man who was finally, truly, at peace with himself. He was no longer a guardian of the city, but a guardian of his own soul, and in that, he had found a strength that no enemy could ever take from him. The return was complete, not because he had reclaimed his old title, but because he had discovered a new one that was far more meaningful. He was a man who had conquered himself, and in doing so had become a true protector of others. What do you do when the world you swore to protect crumbles around you, not from an external threat, but from the insidious rot of your own complacency? What happens when the discipline that once defined you becomes a distant memory, a ghost that haunts your every waking moment? This is the abyss I found myself in, a chasm of my own making. I was a guardian, a title earned through years of relentless training, of pushing my body and mind to their absolute limits. The steel in my hand was an extension of my will, a symbol of my unwavering commitment. But I had become a king in a court of comfort, my throne built on the laurels of past victories. The fire in my belly, the insatiable hunger for growth, had been replaced by the smoldering embers of self-satisfaction. And in that state of blissful ignorance, I had grown weak. The wake-up call was not a gentle nudge, but a catastrophic failure. A threat I had underestimated, a situation I had misjudged, a moment of hesitation that cost me everything. The details are not important, the outcome is what matters. I failed. The people I was sworn to protect paid the price for my arrogance. The weight of that failure was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that threatened to extinguish what little light remained within me. I retreated from the world, a wounded animal seeking solace in the darkness. My days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of regret and self-loathing. The discipline I had once embraced as a source of strength now felt like a cruel mockery. The steel, once a symbol of my power, now gathered dust in a forgotten corner, a silent testament to my disgrace. But even in the deepest, darkest pits of despair, a single spark can ignite a revolution. For me, that spark was a question, a simple yet profound inquiry that cut through the fog of my self-pity. Was this the end? Was this the legacy I wanted to leave behind, the final chapter in the story of the Guardian? The answer, when it finally came, was a resounding no. But the path back was not as simple as picking up my sword and charging back into the fray. I had to rebuild myself from the ground up, not as the guardian I once was, but as something new, something stronger, something that had been forged in the crucible of failure. The first step was to embrace the pain, not to numb it, not to run from it, but to truly feel it, to let it wash over me in all its agonizing intensity. The The pain of my failure, the pain of my weakness, the pain of my regret. It was a cleansing fire, a necessary purification. I had to acknowledge the truth of my situation, to strip away the layers of denial and self-deception that had become my armor. I was not a fallen hero. I was a man who had lost his way. And the only way to find my way back was to start at the very beginning. I returned to the basics, the foundational principles of my training that I had long since abandoned. The pre-dawn runs, the grueling hours of physical conditioning, the endless repetition of forms and techniques. But this time it was different. It was not about achieving a certain level of physical prowess. It was about reclaiming my will. It was about teaching my body and mind to obey a single, unwavering command, to endure, to persevere, to push beyond the limits of what I thought was possible. The steel became my constant companion, my teacher, my confessor. In its cold, hard surface, I saw a reflection of my own imperfections, my own weaknesses. But I also saw the potential for strength, for resilience, for a will that could be honed to a razor's edge. Each swing of the blade was a declaration of war against the man I had become, a promise to the man I was determined to be. But physical discipline was only half the battle. The true war was being waged in the battlefield of my mind. The voices of doubt, of fear, of self-loathing were a constant barrage, a relentless assault on my resolve. I had to learn to quiet the noise, to find a place of stillness in the midst of the storm. I turned to the ancient wisdom of the Stoics, to the teachings of men who had faced far greater adversities than my own, and had emerged not just unscathed but stronger. I learned to differentiate between what was within my control and what was not. I could not change the past, I could not undo my failures, but I could control my thoughts, my actions, my responses to the present moment. This was the true source of my power, the one thing that no one could ever take from me. I began to practice mindfulness, to observe my thoughts without judgment, to see them for what they were, fleeting, ephemeral, and ultimately powerless unless I gave them power. The journey was long and arduous. There were days when I wanted to give up, to surrender to the darkness that still lingered at the edges of my soul. But I would always return to the steel, to the simple, honest work of honing my craft. In those moments of doubt, the discipline was my anchor, the one constant in a sea of uncertainty. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to change. The hollowness in my chest was replaced by a quiet, steady strength. The fire in my belly was rekindled, not as a raging inferno of ambition, but as a controlled, focused flame of purpose. I was no longer fighting for redemption, for the approval of others. I was fighting for myself, for the man I knew I could be. The fallen guardian was dead. In his place stood a man who had been broken, but who had refused to be defeated. A man who had looked into the abyss and had found not despair, but the raw, unadulterated power of the human will. A man who understood that true strength is not about never falling, but about having the courage to rise, again and again, no matter how many times you are knocked down. This is my story, but it is also your story. We have all faced our own failures, our own moments of darkness. We have all felt the sting of regret, the weight of our own weakness. But I am here to tell you that it is not the fall that defines us, but the return. It is the conscious, deliberate choice to pick ourselves up, to dust ourselves off, and to take one more step forward. The path of discipline and steel is not an easy one. It is a path of pain, of sacrifice, of relentless self-improvement. But it is also a path of liberation, of self-discovery, of unlocking the limitless potential that lies dormant within each and every one of us. So I ask you, what will you do with your pain? Will you let it consume you, or will you use it as fuel to forge a stronger, more resilient version of yourself? Will you surrender to the darkness, or will you find the courage to reignite the fire within? The choice, as always, is yours. But know this, the steel is waiting. The path is clear. The only thing standing in your way is you. Take that first step. Embrace the struggle. And watch as you become the architect of your own return, the master of your own destiny, the guardian of your own soul. The world is waiting for you to rise. Don't keep it waiting any longer. Pick up your steel, whatever form it may take, and begin the work. Your return starts now. Join us. Become part of a community of individuals who are committed to the path of self-mastery. Share your stories, your struggles, your triumphs. Let us be a source of strength and inspiration for one another. The journey is long, but you do not have to walk it alone. Subscribe, engage, and let us forge a new legacy together, one of discipline, one of steel, one of unwavering resolve. The chronicles of our quest have just begun. What will your chapter be?